Hello and welcome to the Good Society Forum. My name is Emma Skye and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum, which is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. So please do follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. If you have ideas for Good Society Forum sessions and want to be a panelist, please email us. We're really keen that you participate. And to start off, can you just write in the chat function where you are participating from so we can get a sense of who our audience is? So we have from Sydney. From Helsinki, hello, Minna Yavanpa. From Heidi Machlou from Miami. Alberto from Brazil. Elizabeth from Norwalk, Connecticut. And Lama Musawi from Lebanon. Bobby from London. We've got a couple there. John Jerk Christopoulos from Dallas. Renee from Sesame Street, hello. Liz Siegel from Oxford. Hi Liz, hope you're having fun at Oxford. Norma from Hamden. Miriam from Lebanon. Nada from Saudi. Lena, a Lebanese from Helsinki. Malcolm from Glasgow. Carla from Porto Alegre, Brazil. Muna from Qatar. We've got Fit Bill from London. Marianne from Lebanon. Courtney from New Haven. Martin from Ghana. And Niz, my co-host. Niz is sick in London. Tom from Beirut. So a really wide audience from all around the world. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being part of our Good Society Forum network. The community is you, so thank you for once again being with us. Now, even before the coronavirus crisis struck, people in the Middle East and North Africa were protesting against injustice and inequality. The pandemic and the lockdown measures taken by governments have paralyzed economies and threatened to tip millions of people into poverty, with women, refugees, migrant workers, and those working in the informal economy among the worst affected. And our hearts go out to the people of Beirut, who on top of everything else, were also afflicted by that massive explosion in August, which killed over 180 people and injured over 6,000. Now, 21 billionaires in the Middle East and North Africa saw their wealth increase by nearly $10 billion since the start of the COVID crisis, almost double the estimated amount required to rebuild Lebanon's shattered capital, while 45 million more people in the region could be pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic. So today we are joined by 3 experts from the Middle East to explore how to reduce inequality in the region. And we're going to hear from our 3 speakers first, and then we will take your questions. So please write your questions in the chat function. So our first speaker today is Nabil Abdo. He's a senior policy advisor for the Middle East and North Africa at Oxfam. And Nabil recently published a report for Oxfam entitled "For a Decade of Hope, Not Austerity, Towards a Fair and Inclusive Recovery to Fight Inequality." And he previously worked for the Arab NGO Network for Development, the International Labour Organization, and with CAFA to end violence against women. Nabil, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Let me share this. Okay. I hope the screen appears well to everyone. So thank you everyone for attending and for listening to what I have to say. So my presentation actually will be about the report that we released last month about inequality in the region, especially in light with the COVID crisis. So what I want to try to show is that COVID is not, could not be considered as a shock in the region, but it was merely an accelerator of something that was inevitable because of the policies that have been adopted for at least a decade in the region. The region received COVID with one of the highest inequalities in the world, where 10% of the population controls 64% of income, while the bottom 50% only control 10% of the income. And in this last decade, we saw the number of rich people who have $5 million and above in 4 countries, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Morocco, increased by 24%. Their number and their wealth has increased by nearly 13.2%. And also most of the labor force in the region working in the informal economy, it means without any kind of labor protection or income security. So, the absence of automatic economic stabilizer, like we call, is like unemployment insurance, welfare, all the social protection systems, and also because progressivity in tax systems have been eroded, which left the region exposed to the COVID, and also the peoples of the region exposed to the massive impact on their well-being. So the austerity paradigm that has been adopted in the region for the last 10 years at least, and even more, has had like several features, main features that we can talk about. One of it is shifting the tax burden to households and relieving corporations and the rich. So for example, in Egypt, in just 4 years, the tax contributions of corporations has fell by 33%, while the contribution of households has increased by 12% as a result of increase in consumption tax alone. In Tunisia, the same trend has been observed, where the tax contribution of corporations fell by nearly 40%, and those of households increased by 10%. And at the same time, we have been witnessing a shift in terms of social protection systems from universality to targeting. Basically by removing subsidies in different countries in the region. And when subsidies were removed as a result or pushed by the International Monetary Fund, it was promised that the savings and subsidies would translate into better spending on social spending, better spending on safety nets, etc. But this not happened. For example, in Jordan, in 2012, subsidies constitute 4% of GDP, and social protection nearly 12% of GDP. Nowadays, social protection constitutes 6% only of GDP, and subsidies 0.2% of GDP. So subsidies decrease, but also the spending on social protection as well as a share of GDP. So the promise of better social systems was not realized. And at the same time, spending on health increased, out-of-pocket spending of households. So households have seen their health expenditure increase as a result of the deterioration of social infrastructure and the increase of the role of the private sector in providing healthcare and education. And also, so all those reforms were made from the point of view of we need to save money rather than we need to redistribute and we need to reduce inequality. And also the issue of gender has been largely neglected, and during the last decade and even more, all what we hear about women is that they do not participate enough in paid labor, where everything else has been ignored. And the issue of gender has been only seen from the point of view of labor market and not from the impact of macroeconomic policies or the gendered impact of macroeconomic policies in general. So the result was that household and low-income people have paid the price of the coronavirus response and even the recovery as we expect later. So this is I won't stop here. So even in response, there was high inequality and austerity measure in terms of response. So for example, while billionaires increased their wealth by at least 10 billion, according to the ILO, labor income loss is up to $85 billion for the MENA region. So workers have lost 85 billion of their income, while billionaires have been stacking wealth. In Egypt has introduced a 1% coronavirus tax on wage earners in order to fund the response, while leaving billionaires and rich people and millionaires intact. So and in Jordan, the same way, for example, the Jordanian government has been using the maternity insurance contribution for 2020 to support vulnerable groups through cash transfers. So this is a blatant redistribution of income and resources from middle-income households to low-middle-income households to the poor, while the rich has been left out of any kind of contribution or any kind of responsibility in this crisis. And on top of that, 11% of stimulus packages in the region only have been directed to people and social protection and health. So now we talk about building back better. But in order to build back better, we need to have these lessons learned on what we have seen during the pandemic and even before. What we have learned is that social spending is a cornerstone of economic growth. Where people are left vulnerable and left unprotected, they cannot produce in this economy. And at the same time, job security has been also very important, where in the past decade and more, we have seen flexibilization of labor in order to save on companies under the pretext of encouraging employment and foreign direct investment. We have seen that the only people who have been, or the people who haven't been as touched as most of workers have been workers in the public sector. And those are the workers who have been facing most of the attacks on their job security and on their wage, etc. Because there is the idea that government is big, and then we need to reduce government by reducing public sector employment. And also, we have been left with little fiscal space. Countries were not able to spend because there was no enough tax revenues because the rich were not paying their fair share. So, I mean, austerity was not inevitable. That is what we learned. For example, in Jordan, if a net worth tax had been enforced since 2010 at a rate of 2%, it would have generated enough fund to avoid an IMF loan program that has encouraged austerity in Jordan. In Lebanon, who is now facing a debt crisis, a net worth tax of 2% over those 10 years could have been equivalent to 82% of its total foreign debt service payment since 2011. In Egypt, the government is having a one-off payment to informal workers for only 3 months, where with a 5% one-time 5% solidarity tax would have generated enough money to give 3 million informal workers the minimum wage for 1 year. So my last thing that I want to say is that building back better or having a fair and inclusive recovery should be built upon the rich making their fair contribution through imposing a solidarity net worth of at least 5% on high net worth individuals, impose a permanent progressive net worth tax, creating fiscal space through decreasing spending on defense and security budgets, and we need to talk more about that and redirect it to health and education, and also restore progressivity to the tax systems in the region. And also, if we want to remove subsidies, we should not remove them as a standalone action, but as part of a whole redistributive plan and part of a transformation towards a green economy. Thank you, and yeah, so more on the question front if you have any questions. I hope I did not pass my time limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nabil, for that presentation. And, you know, your report is a really excellent report with some very shocking discoveries. Now, our second speaker is Sally Abi Khalil. And Sally is a humanitarian and development practitioner with 20 years of experience in the Middle East. She's the country director of Oxfam in Lebanon and has served as chair of the Lebanon Humanitarian International NGO Forum. And she is a 2020 Yale World Fellow. Thank you, Sally, for joining us.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, everyone, for joining this conversation. And also thanks to Nabil for sort of setting the picture more broadly and more regionally. I'm just going to focus my time to zoom in a little bit on Lebanon, and specifically on social protection as a tool to address the rampant inequalities, I mean, in the region, but specifically in Lebanon. So just so you know, and a reminder that social protection is actually enshrined in the human rights, in the Universal Human Rights Declaration of 1948. And sort of this enshrinement has given social protection this rights-based approach. And so really moving social protection to an obligation of states and also within international governance structure. Social protection is also firmly embedded in the SDGs under Goal 1 of no poverty, and specifically Objective 1.3, so implementing free and equitable and fair social protection systems, as well as social protection floors. So once the pandemic hit, the COVID pandemic globally, we saw 169 countries that have to date enacted some form of social assistance measure in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this type of social assistance came in different forms. Most of it came as social assistance of in-kind transfers, such as food distributions, or cash transfers, such as top-ups to people already receiving some form of social assistance within programs that are present in the country, or more targeted one-off cash transfers to specific vulnerable households, such as women-led households or households with disabilities, or top-ups of social insurance schemes such as unemployment benefits. In the region, we saw several countries respond in such a fashion. Tunisia is one example, Egypt, and we also saw Iraq even, and Lebanon. But let me zoom in briefly on the Lebanon context. So Lebanon is facing detrimental multi-layered crises that are really threatening to undermine its political, economic, and financial and social fabric. Firstly, back starting in 2011, at the onset of the Syria crisis, we saw the economy hit a recession. Growth started to fall and to diminish. The tourism sector, the real estate sector, various sort of sectors in the economy crashed. In 2019, September, October of last year, we saw an economic collapse and with the sort of the banking and financial situation in the country completely at a standstill, and with the currency of the country losing for now about 80% of its value. Then come March 2020, we were hit by the COVID crisis and the impact of the economic impact of the measures, of the lockdown measures that were taken by the government. And then finally, the port explosion of August 4th that basically wiped out the Beirut port, which is the hub of the capital and pretty much half of the capital city of the country. So what we're seeing is very serious repercussions of the social landscape on the poor, on the lower income, but also on the middle class. Poverty rates, the most recent poverty rates that just came out about a month ago by UN ESQA, show that that poverty rates have jumped from 28% in 2019 to over 55% in May 2020. So this figure right now is definitely higher, and with extreme poverty rising from 8% to 23%. So basically, the number of poor in Lebanon has increased from 1.1 million to 2.7 million. And since we're talking since the theme of the discussion is on inequality, Lebanon is one of the most unequal countries in the world, where with wealth distribution, on wealth distribution, and it's ranking actually 20th globally. So 10% actually owns 70.6% of wealth in the country. And this comes also at a backdrop of rising inflation, increased unemployment, underemployment, increased informality, household income sharply declining, a sharp decline in flow of remittances, which many households and the actual economy deeply depend on, and a deterioration of health and education services in the country, and we're heading into some form of austerity should there be some form of IMF bailout as well. So within sort of this this backdrop, as activists and as Oxfam and several sort of stakeholders in the country continue to see social protection, a social protection system and social protection approaches as key to addressing these rampant inequalities and some of the shocking figures that are now emerging as one response to start to address the inequalities and the poverty that we're seeing in the country. There's definitely no silver bullet, especially for such a complex context as Lebanon. But there is growing consensus that among academics and practitioners around the world, that social protection really does constitute an effective response to poverty and vulnerability, and is an essential component of economic and development strategies. But this practice of social protection has evolved over the years, and to shift away from a social safety net approach to a much broader set of policies, social policies and programs and interventions to protect basic levels of consumption for the poor and the poorest households, and to invest in human capital and assets. I just want to touch upon some of the more technical points before my time is up, to really consider as we look at social protection, a social protection response in Lebanon. It's important to note that there are several social protection programs under social assistance and social insurance in Lebanon that do exist, but it is they're piecemeal and there's no coordination among them. So one key point is for these programs to come under one clear and comprehensive national social protection framework. And this framework needs to be well coordinated, both vertically and horizontally, and by the multiplicity of players that do exist. Because while this is a government responsibilities in a country such as Lebanon, there are multiple players that are also part of this, these programs and these interventions. Secondly, the point of financing, which I think Nabil touched upon very well. Political will, there needs to be a will for this, social protection framework to come together, and for it to also be rights-based, to be universal. And when we talk about universal, it doesn't mean that everyone has the right to these programs and to the support at the same time, but everyone has the right to the support in times of shocks, and to a system that also integrates migrant domestic workers that are in the country, provides the protection and refugees, as Lebanon hosts over 1 million Syrian refugees, and also is coupled with specific social protections on SGBV, for example. And finally, the targeting counts, how we target, and it needs to be a key component, needs to be the labor market activation component. So how do we reactivate the economy and people to re-enter the economy by building specific skill sets, by protecting labor under the labor law and making sure that the labor law is respected, and the decent work agenda. So I'll stop there and answer further questions. Thank you.
Sally, thank you very much for those comments and real practical solutions to address inequalities. Now, our third speaker is Dr. Charlotte Karam, who is Director of the Center of Inclusive Business and Leadership for Women at the American University of Beirut. And her research focuses on the responsible engagement of organizations, in particular corporate social responsibility, women's careers, and inclusive organizations. Charlotte, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Emma. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you all here today. And thanks to Nabil and Sally for the beginning, excellent context. I'd just like to reiterate what Sally said, like as we speak, and as she noted, our home, Lebanon, is a case in point where inequality is rampant. It's a tiny country where so much has gone wrong. Just this last year, Lebanon, in fact, has entered into unprecedented chaos and devastation, with people protesting in the street against injustice and inequality wrought by the decade of austerity that Nabil spoke to, and generations of corruption that we must acknowledge. This economic downturn and collapse that Sally talked about, coupled with COVID-19 and the human-made disaster of the Beirut explosion. And then in the context, as Sally noted, of the refugee crisis, where Lebanon has disproportionately shouldered responsibility, and the regional turmoil that surrounds us. So my fellow panelists, Nabil and Sally, have pointed to many very important strategies and key recommendations from their national level policy, obligations of the state. From this perspective, and they drew our attention to what are some ways forward if another decade of pain is to be averted. Clearly, governments and these frameworks for social protection must take concerted actions to reduce inequality. Providing public services to protect ordinary people by taxing the richest and guaranteeing decent work are key. And in this sense, my fellow panelists urge national governments to enact crucial policy measures to secure fair recovery for Lebanon and for the Middle East more broadly. And I, of course, am of the conviction that this is a necessary endeavor. We must work to ensure that governments are held accountable and that governments provide public services. This, no doubt, is critically essential. And I think from where I sit, and in addition to this, we have to ask, what role can other actors play in reducing inequality in the Middle East? Who are the other actors and what can be done? From where I sit, which is in a regional business school with a vibrant and broad executive reach in training and consulting and business education, we work very closely with SMEs and family business across the region. And where I sit in a center that devotes its work to building inclusive workplaces and employer HR structures, I see that the promise of that which is government-led has been slow, it's been ineffective, and has often failed to result in changes for the most vulnerable. This is even the case when national strategies are put in place and pushed and monitored by international community. The promise of government-led policy measures to secure just and decent work practices continues to be a space of struggle and contestation. This doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting in any way that we should stop these efforts. It just means, in my perspective, that we need alternative strategies and innovative efforts. All hands on deck, as it were. This therefore begs the question, are there alternative and parallel mechanisms to devise and implement more just processes and practices of inclusion that can help to reduce inequality in the Middle East? Alternative mechanisms are particularly important in the context of failing states or weak governments, many of which we have in the region, and Lebanon is a great example of this. One area that we have been focused on at our center is the role of employers, public employers, private employers, and nonprofit employers. Their role in reducing inequalities through structural change has to be considered, and in my view, has to be discussed. Even with the ills and the long history and evidence of the negative repercussions of the neoliberal market system, businesses and employers need to be part of the conversation and definitely part of the solution. You know, I need to say here that when I talk about businesses, I'm not referring to the multinational corporations that are headquartered in the north. I'm talking about the businesses across the region, the local SMEs and larger businesses that provide employment across the region. Our focus at Sybil in particular is on building and devising more inclusive HR systems in partnership with these businesses and in partnership with these employers. So what are the steps that employers can champion and devise that can help to reduce inequalities? This is the question I want to ask. Are there things that are currently being done by employers, despite the failings of governments and despite the failings of macro regulatory bodies? Are more employers willing to do so, to step in, to devise alternatives? Are there indigenous examples that we can already see of employer activities in the region? And can these be identified? Can they be improved, augmented, and then scaled? These are questions that we have put at the center of the work that we do at our center. These are similar to what Nabil has been calling for in the sense of a new paradigm in his report. For me, this translates into asking about a new paradigm for responsible employers. What is the role of employers in reducing inequality? What is the role of responsible employers in dignified work and in informal labor, in refugee crisis, in decreasing the gender gap, in leading the way for inclusive systems and setting workplace contexts free from gender-based violence? We could delve deeply into each of these areas, but in light of my time, I want to just focus in on, instead of a gargantuan task of unpacking the intensification of inequalities in the region that's already worse in the world, and instead of the gargantuan task of unpacking the economic structures across the region that tend to incentivize informality and increase inequality. Of course, these are necessary and valiant foci, but for me, the focus and our focus at Sybil is much smaller and targeted and segmented. Instead, we focus on a handful of employers in different sectors in 11 countries in which we operate in the region. This to us is a manageable focus with the intent of improving the lives of employees today in the immediate circumstances. A lot of our work focuses on women's economic participation, which as Nabil alluded to, women across the region stand for about 21% and is consistently the lowest level of female participation rates in the world. And under COVID and the current economic downturn in the region, it's estimated that though 41% who lose their job will be women. So I'm now going to turn just to, in the remainder of my intervention, I want to hone in on 3 key action points that we've been engaged in with our partner employers. The first is identifying local trailblazing employers. Are there examples that already exist in the region? And let us try to tease out these positive examples. The second point I'll talk about is how do we scale this and begin to mobilize willing employers, those half converted, already thinking about alternative forms of inclusive systems? How do we bring them together to create a community of responsible employers? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the measuring and monitoring and the importance of data in the region and the problem of the data deficit. So on the first point, in terms of identifying employers as trailblazers, this is not unheard of in the region. We need to identify and celebrate local indigenous examples. Learning from South-South dialogue is extremely important. We've been documenting certain cases. I can give one example of Zen Telecom in Kuwait, who has branches across the region. They have reached 25% of women in their leadership position, which is unheard of globally. In 2008, they saw an increase of 88% in female recruitment, and I can go on. But identifying these local examples and learning from them from a contextualized perspective is an important view and important work that we're doing. This brings me to my second point, which is the idea of mobilizing employers who are willing to explore and work together to reduce inequalities. In my view, it is a mistake not to engage employers directly. We have worked with SMEs and larger employers in the region to put in place protections and policies in lieu of there being no laws or effective implementation strategies at the national level. Some of our work has focused around gender-based violence in the workplace, and we have successfully implemented or I should say, the employers have successfully implemented anti-sexual harassment policies in their codes of conduct, despite the fact that the government does not mandate it. How can we scale this up? The final point, and then I'll conclude, is that we need to spend time around overcoming the data deficit in the region. It is a critical step needed to properly tackle inequalities. Some would say without data, the focus and design of social protection initiatives are misjudged, they're misdirected, and the impact is often erroneously assumed. We need data. We need to collect it in a rigorous and indigenous, iterative manner where we ask local questions and get local answers. This is the inspiration for an index that we'll be releasing in the fall called the KIP Index. It will be the first Arab MENA feminist participatory measure of recruitment, retention, promotion of women in order to track employer and women's perspectives and in order to do concrete policies for these employers to implement. I'll stop there. I have a little bit more to say about the methodologies behind it, but maybe during the question and answer period. Thank you so much, Emma.
So thank you very much for that, Charlotte. And I'd like to invite Nabil and Sally to join us now to take questions from the audience. And so this is the time for people to submit their questions in the chat function, and I will come to your questions. The first question comes from Michelle Rentener, and Michel is the Dutch ambassador to Iraq. So he is actually joining us from Baghdad. And he's a good friend and is a good friend of the Good Society Forum. And the question that Michel has is about politics. He says, you guys, you've made three really good presentations and have highlighted really what the problem is. But how about the political element of finding solutions? Most leaders in the region do not seem to be disturbed by the inequality. It doesn't seem to keep them awake at night. So what incentives could we advocate for those in power to start reducing the inequality? So I'm going to turn that first to Nabil and then get viewpoints from Sally and Charlotte. Nabil.
Yeah, thanks. So also I want to say something because I think Malham, after him, he said they avoided politics. And I think the economic policies that we spoke about, or that also that I showed in the presentation, are at the heart of politics. It's a matter of political economy and who controls, who has the power to influence tax policies, to influence social protection policies, etc. And in the crisis, we have seen it in a very, very stark way, where the rich were left aside and everything was on households and the poor. So no, politics is at the heart of what we're talking about, and policy is not something dissociated from politics. So going back to the question is that, yeah, exactly, most leaders are not disturbed. I mean, a lot of things is about political capture, who benefits, who is close to the circles of power, etc., and how the wealth is divided in the region. But also, I think one of the important issues is that we need more organizing. We need social movements are politics, and social movements press leaders to enact policies. So when those leaders close on civic space and close on social movements, there is here a problem. And I think these policies were also enabled by the donor community and by international organizations and the national financial institutions. Amongst them are the EU, the International Monetary Fund, etc. And I think also so here Mr. Michel also could play a role in that, right? So the idea is when you give countries in the region bailout and loans, and you don't and you put conditionalities on them, and the conditionalities are increase in direct taxation and the conditionalities are control the wage bill in the public sector, etc. And you don't talk about progressive taxes, and you only talk about attracting foreign direct investment. We don't talk about wealth. We don't talk about social spending, universality, and social protection. Here we are enabling this kind of behavior. And at the same time, when we give also loans and programs to countries where they crack down on civic space, and we say we want civil society to participate and to be a partner, how can civil society be a partner when they cannot operate? And I think here there is also a lot of responsibility on the international community as well. So it's a combination of both, where movements will press on the ground, and they are doing that. But also, I think there is a moral obligation by the international community also to uphold its own standards and its own principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Sally.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks, Nabil, also for what you said. I'm just going to add a couple of brief points to what Nabil said. I mean, it's also, just to add, lack of data is also very political. In a country such as Lebanon, when you haven't had a census since 1932, since before the independence of the country, this is a very political decision. When you don't have a social registry, when you don't have when the last figures of poverty were led by the UN in 2008, I think, and it was only last month till we had any form of new figures. That's very political as well, and no multidimensional assessment to any form of poverty. So this is all, very, very political context. Specifically in Lebanon, yes, the plethora of political parties and actors and figures in Lebanon that are currently governing the country are definitely not losing sleep at night because of wealth inequality, but they are starting to lose sleep because they are worried about their own ability to continue to rule, and this is because of the social movements and the public pressures that the revolution and the uprising have placed on them since October of last year. And while we're not seeing these massive protests as we did in the early days of the revolution, this pressure continues and these social movements continue, and you're also seeing organic movements of a social solidarity economy that is emerging, that are slowly thinking of what does a neoliberal banking and economic financial institutions look like in the country, and learning from other examples around the world. A demand for elections, and clearly based on a reformed electoral law and a merit-based economy. So it's slow moving, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And clearly the obstacles are many and are there, but there is a new pressures, at least in Lebanon. So I'm not generalizing across the country, across the region. Sorry, in Lebanon, these pressures are currently there. They continue to be there. But yes, I do want to reiterate what Nabil said. There is a responsibility by the international community as well here on how they also apply pressures and support the movements on the ground as well.
Thank you, Sally. And Charlotte, over to you.
I won't take too much time, but I think I reject the question that they're not playing politics with this statement. And I think we embody the politics in the ways that Nabil and Sally spoke. And if I could speak a little bit around holding accountable those in power, whether that is the government, the leaders, by going down onto the streets, embodying the protest, mobilizing the protest, coming up with alternative proposals for recovery, pushing them, running in the elections, whether the municipal elections or parliamentary elections. I mean, there's that level. Then there's the speaking power or speaking of oppression to the powerful at the risk of being imprisoned, which many of our colleagues have been imprisoned. or have been beaten by various groups within the country. We play politics every single day, and it's not a game in the sense. What it is survival, and quite the opposite. Particularly in the case of Lebanon, we are embodying politics in everything that we do, and we have suffered the consequences of that, and we continue forward and want to suffer because we need the change.
So thank you, Charlotte. The next question is from Minna Järvenpää, who's from Finland. She's in Helsinki, but is a very good friend of Lebanon. She asks, what strategies do poor people use to stay afloat in these dire circumstances, with a drop in remittances and lacking social protections? How do they live? And I'll start with Sally first on that one.
Thank you for the question. It's a difficult and heartbreaking answer, to be honest. Recently, we've seen in Lebanon a rise of Lebanese looking to migrate, so putting their families at risk, and going on boats and trying to cross the Mediterranean to try and reach, Cyprus or other European land, in order to seek a better life for their families. And this, and just last week, a family lost, 2 children, 6 and age 3, just by trying to migrate. And this comes, after, years and years since the onset of the Syria crisis, of Syrian refugees who were facing persecution, displacement, poverty, vulnerability, and we're trying to either leave Syria and to seek shelter and protection for their families, or leaving Lebanon and migrating. And unfortunately, we saw what happened. Europe completely shut down its borders to all of the refugees and made it impossible. While resettlement is also extremely limited. The numbers, don't even constitute, barely, not even 1% of Syrian refugees that are present in the region. Same for Palestinian refugees in the region. So sadly, migration, a very dangerous migration, is a very negative and dangerous coping strategy that people are adhering. We see in Lebanon, recent study from the WFP shown that food insecurity among the Lebanese has sharply risen, and that, actually, while we've been following food insecurity for Syrian refugees in Lebanon since 2011, this recent study actually compares food insecurity of Palestinian, Syrian refugees, as well as Lebanese vulnerable and poor, and the figures are really not that different, sadly. So people are skipping meals. We're seeing beggars on the street, families taking their children out of school, or child labor has increased dramatically. So the negative coping strategies, and I've really just named a few, are really significant. And with rising inflation, which is right now, Lebanon is second after Zimbabwe in terms of highest inflation in the world, and Venezuela comes third. So with such staggering figures and economic situation, these negative coping strategies are sadly going to continue, and people will put their lives at danger, or and their families, just to be able to survive.
Nabil, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm good. I think Sally gave a very comprehensive answer.
Okay, the next question is from Nadine.
Can I just add something?
Please, Charlotte.
I just wanted to say that absolutely, just to add to what Sally was saying, we can't overlook the emergence of this organic community organizing that really has swept the country in terms of immediate response to needs and rebuilding and bringing in food and schooling and so on. So the community organizing within at least after the Beirut explosion, has been, widespread and is immediately attending to some of the needs. The risk of that, though, is that you also see a rise of feudal organizing. So people going back to their tribal leaders or back to their feudal leaders. So where during the protests and the revolution, you started seeing a severance of these ties after the explosion, and in the context of such despair, you see some of these ties being revived. But I just want to speak to community organizing. I think it's extremely important in this context.
Well, thank you. And that brings us on to the question that Nadine has, which is about the cooperative economy. And she says, we've seen now a trend towards local production, growing one's own food, informal networks, relief and aid. What can you tell us about policy that can lend greater support to worker cooperatives versus the more traditional individualistic support for communities? And Charlotte, do you want to answer that?
I mean, I could start by highlighting a specific example that colleagues of mine have begun at AUB, at the university that I'm at. It's called Beirut, which is one of many initiatives that try to bring together people from various walks of life and various disciplines and various perspectives to organize in a way and come up with an alternative a strategy that tackles 4 specific areas, which is healthcare, small and medium-sized businesses, community health, and education. And it very much works in a cooperative model where there are initiatives and programs being rolled out as we speak, 3 days after the explosion. And around this, the organizers are creating a narrative and documenting as we go to try to create some sort of, and document the ways in which this type of organizing happens and how we can strengthen the cooperative, this alternative cooperation and alternative cooperative structure in the wake of this crisis and other crises. I'll stop there and turn to my colleagues.
Nabil.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I think the question is really important because I mean, for long we have been everything. I mean, also this comes to the policies I was talking about, is that the donor community and all the funding and even like national policies, etc., we're hailing entrepreneurship and the need for people, support for people, for entrepreneurs, etc. Suddenly, the aim was to make everyone an entrepreneur and no one would be employed, right? So, but what happened is we only created survivalist activities, etc. So, and we moved away from the cooperative model, which is also very ingrained in the tradition of the region and in the social movements of the region. And I think now it's a very good opportunity to reignite this kind of cooperative movement, because what we need is more collective efforts. We need more workers coming together. We need even producers to come together in order to break these monopolies or these patterns, and also provide an alternative policies. I'm saying, yeah, we have an alternative model that we can implement, and it's not only something theoretical. And here it's important to have the proper laws and legislations, because there are a lot of challenges in terms of and I think a lot of actors should work on that. But in the same time, I think many actors, especially in the NGO sector and the NGO sector, should not also repeat the same mistakes of turning the cooperatives to a donor-dependent model and a donor-driven model, because this is what we have been seeing. And now we see this kind of organic revival, and I think here we need to capture this, and in order to support without turning the model and turning it into a funding opportunity. So I think this is very important. And here also cooperative movements usually flourish with also social movements, with political movements. And here I think it's very important to link the two, in the sense that cooperatives are not only for people to be able to get by, but also it is a political model, it's a democratic model of business and also of ways of consuming and etc. So we need to emphasize on that and not depoliticize it as well.
Thank you, Nabil. And Sally.
Just quickly to add to what's already been said, and specifically to stress the importance of a legal framework here of cooperative. I mean, in Lebanon, the legal framework technically exists, but the ability to, be able to sort of register these new initiatives, new cooperative is practically impossible. Given the importance of this socio-political and economic model, as stressed by both Nabil and Charlotte, we are likely to face these challenges for the translation and shift to this type of approach and system, and so it is important to continue to address that, and that that protection needs to be there. It needs to be supported. It needs to be respected. It needs to be challenged when need be, and because as Nabil said, we don't want to professionalize it, because what's now happening is these initiatives end up being registered as NGOs, because that's the easiest way to function in a country, or to register. I mean, it depends on the country. Here I'm talking about Lebanon specifically, and then what happens once you do that over time, you lose the essence of what you were trying to do, and you become donor dependent or donor driven, as Nabil highlighted. So it's really important to have that legal framework present.
Well, thank you for that, Sally. And we're nearly out of time. And as it's the Good Society Forum, we always want to leave with a message of hope. And so I'm going to turn to each of our panelists in the last 2 minutes that we have to just say, what is it that gives you hope for the future? I'm going to go first to Nabil, then Sally, and then Charlotte. Nabil.
Yes, a difficult question in these times. I think what gives me hope is that, I don't know, but I think I mean the way that we are also approaching this crisis, and the ideas that have been out there, and the need to take this opportunity is what gives me hope. But this is very momentary. If we don't take it, I don't know what will happen. Thanks.
Sally.
It's a difficult question, but I think I'm 42 years old, and have spent most of my life trying to make Lebanon and this region a better place, and was continuously disappointed for various reasons. But at the same time, I think the amazing sort of response to post Beirut blast of people has definitely given me hope, and while there's a lot to work on there, to really sort of bring this together as proper collective action, as we talked about. I think there are some seeds have been planted, and so it will take a long time, but I think if we nurture those seeds that have been planted, it gives me hope that down the line we will start to see that change that we've been all sort of working towards for decades, but it's the younger generation that's going to have to take that mantle. So my bets are on them.
Charlotte, the last word.
Yeah, I agree with what Sally. What gives me hope is, we stop using this word resilience, at least in our circles. Lebanese are not resilient. The Lebanese have the grit, and this, particularly the youth, because, it's no longer being resilient. It's just now it's about grit and holding on and moving forward, and just seeing, the day after the explosion, people on the streets covered in blood, walking through the dust, everybody from older to younger, from all walks of life, helping each other. This community organizing, as Sally was saying, gives me hope, the humanity of it. maybe it's not much to go on, but I think it's a very significant and important piece.
Well, Sally, Nabil, and Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us hope. And from all of us around the world, we're sending lots of love to Lebanon. You're an amazing country, and we're all hoping for a better future for Lebanon and for the people of the Middle East. And thank you to our participants for all your questions and for being with us on the Good Society Forum. Bye for now. Thank you.